Hey there. Forget the friendly campfire tales you may have heard. The truth is darker and, somehow, quieter. Tonight, I'm going to lead you into a forest where three things keep repeating, like a slow heartbeat in the dark. A lonely cabin pelted with stones until dawn. A man lifted away inside his own sleeping bag, carried like a bundled secret, and a towering figure that turns its head, just once, to look back at the camera with something that feels like anger. If you find a strange kind of peace in this shadowed history, leave a like and subscribe so you can return whenever the night feels too loud. Now, let the room soften around you. Let the fire beside us breathe in orange and red, each crackle small enough to be harmless. If you can, dim your lights. Let your shoulders drop. Unclench your jaw. Give your eyes permission to rest, even if they stay open for a while. There's no rush here. The woods will wait. Every year, hundreds of people across North America report encounters with something massive and elusive, often in the dead of night, deep in the woods, far from help. I always linger on that phrase, far from help, because distance changes the way fear behaves. In town, a strange sound is just a sound. Out there, the same sound becomes a question. Since the mid-1990s, tens of thousands of eyewitness reports have been gathered, more than 75,000 by some counts. That number is too large to feel real. Your mind tries to fold it up, the way you fold a blanket that won't quite fit the drawer. So let's unfold it slowly, one corner at a time. Picture a single report. A person driving a narrow road where the asphalt has been chewed at the edges by rain and frost. Pines stand like tall, patient listeners. The windshield is speckled with mist. The heater blows warm air that smells faintly of dust, like an attic. The clock on the dashboard glows a soft green, 1:13 or 2:07. Times blur in the dark. The driver's hands are on the wheel, and they can feel the tiny vibrations of the engine through their palms. That detail always makes me smile in a sad way. Machines are honest. They hum when they work. People are not so simple. People try to pretend they're fine while their pulse is already climbing. They round a bend. Headlights sweep the trees. For a moment, the light catches something upright at the edge of the beam. Not a deer, too tall. Not a bear, too human in the shoulders. It doesn't leap. It doesn't charge. It simply stands, as if it has been standing there all night, waiting for someone to notice. And then the driver notices something stranger, the silence. You know that feeling, don't you? When the background noise, the crickets, the distant frogs, the little chatter of the forest goes thin, like fabric wearing out. The air feels held. Even your breath sounds rude. Maybe the figure takes a step, one step, slow, deliberate. Brush bends, then springs back. The sound is soft, but it lands in the mind like a dropped stone. The driver's foot lifts off the gas. The car coasts. The headlights tremble, because hands tremble. Sometimes, the witness says they smelled it before they saw it. A musky, sour odor, like wet dog and old leaves, and something faintly metallic. Sometimes they describe a vocalization, a long whoop that rises and falls. Not quite owl, not quite wolf. Sometimes there are knocks, 3 of them, spaced like a code, and then it's gone. The beam passes. The road continues. The driver keeps moving, because stopping feels like an invitation. Later, at home, they stand under a bright kitchen light, staring at their own hands, wondering why their fingers still feel cold. They try to explain to a friend. Their mouth keeps choosing the wrong words. The story turns clumsy when it leaves the trees. That clumsiness is part of why Bigfoot is so hard to hold. The creature lives in the spaces where language slips. We call it Bigfoot, Sasquatch, skunk ape, names that change like accents. What stays constant is the sense of something large enough to matter, shy enough to vanish. A bear leaves claw marks and scat. A cougar leaves tracks like commas pressed into dirt. But this story leaves mostly absence. A footprint, if you're lucky. A snapped branch. A feeling that doesn't photograph. To understand why absence can feel so heavy, we have to travel backward through time, sideways, across the world. We'll drift from the chilly heights of the Himalayas, where the Yeti once lived in reverent whispers, to the forests of India, where ancient apes and Western imagination collided. And then we'll return to the damp shores of the Pacific Northwest, where modern Bigfoot lore found a name and a camera. Before we go, though, stay with me at this fireside, and let me slow down one simple thing. A person walking into the woods. It begins with a zipper. Zip soft, like a secret being opened. A jacket pulled tight, a hood lifted. The night air touches the cheeks, cool and a little wet, the way fog kisses skin. Boots meet gravel, and the stones answer back with little clicks, like tiny teeth. The flashlight comes on with a small plastic sound, a button pressed, a beam cutting a pale path through darkness. In that beam, dust floats, slow and lazy, like it has nowhere else to be. The light hits ferns slick with dew. It hits spiderweb threads that flash silver for a heartbeat, then disappear again. The person takes a step, then another. Each step has its own tiny drama. Heel, then toe, a crunch, a slip. The careful correction of balance. Breath comes out in a white puff. The forest receives it without comment. And here is the part I always find lopsided, almost funny. The mind tries to stay polite. It thinks about practical things, where the car keys are, how far it is back to the road, whether the phone has signal. It tries to keep fear tidy, folded into a corner. But the body doesn't cooperate. The body listens. You hear water somewhere, steady and hidden. You hear a branch creak high above. You hear your own clothes whisper as you move. Then you realize something. The forest is not quiet. It is full of sound. So when it goes quiet, when that sound drains away, you feel it the way you feel a sudden pressure change in an elevator. That is why so many accounts mention the moment when everything stops. Not because the world actually stops, but because attention gathers. It's as if the dark turns its face toward you. Now imagine, far away from this gentle fire, a small cabin sits in that attentive dark. It's a simple cabin, rough boards, a sagging roofline, a smell of old smoke embedded in the wood. Inside, men sit with rifles across their knees, not brave, exactly, just stubborn. They can hear something moving outside, not fast, not frantic, heavy. A stone hits the wall, thunk, dust sifts from the rafters. Another stone, thunk. The men look at each other in the dim. Their lantern flame trembles. They can't see what is out there, but they can picture it. Sometimes imagination is crueler than sight. And somewhere else, in another account, a man sleeps under the open sky, wrapped in a sleeping bag that smells like nylon and campfire and his own sweat. He dreams something ordinary, maybe a hallway, maybe an old song. Then the world tilts. The ground leaves him. The bag tightens around his body. He wakes inside a muffled tunnel of fabric, lifted, carried, hearing only his own breath and the dull thud of footsteps. Those stories are waiting for us later. So is that brief, infamous film, the figure striding away, then turning its head, looking back. For now, let a softer question settle in your mind. What if Bigfoot is not only an animal people hunt with cameras? What if it is also a mirror, held up to our need for wilderness, for mystery, for a place the modern world hasn't smoothed into certainty? Take a slow breath in. Let it fill your ribs. Let it go. We'll begin our global drift in the high mountains, where snow can swallow sound, and footprints can look like messages left by ghosts. We'll listen to the older names first, the older fears, the older reverence, and then we'll follow the thread back home. to the wet evergreens, where a new name Bigfoot was born. I'm going to confess something. Honestly, when I first heard the word Bigfoot as a kid, it sounded like a joke, like a costume, like a prank pulled on a summer camp counselor. But the older I get, the more I notice how jokes often grow out of unease. People laugh at what they don't know how to place, and when they're alone at night, they remember what they laughed at, and the laughter dries up. There's a whole field built around that uneasy space. It has a long, winding name: cryptozoology, a study of animals that are unknown, legendary, or thought extinct. Creatures whose existence is disputed, unsubstantiated, always just out of reach. Cryptids, they call them. I like the sound of that word. It feels like a locked drawer. Even if you never cared about the term, you know the feeling it points to. The feeling of seeing a shape in fog and wanting it to be more than fog. The feeling of finding a track in soft ground and wanting it to belong to something rare. The feeling of standing at the edge of a dark tree line and thinking there could be something there, and it could be watching. And what's strange in that soft, slow way, not in a jump scare way, is that people who never met, separated by oceans and centuries, keep telling stories with the same outline. A wild figure, hair, height, isolation, a line between our world and theirs. It's as if the human mind has a favorite shadow to paint. Sometimes I imagine the first person who ever told a Bigfoot-like story was not trying to entertain anyone at all. They were trying to explain why the woods felt different on certain nights. They were trying to teach a child where not to wander. They were trying to speak respect into the darkness, the way you speak softly in a temple. So when we talk about Bigfoot, it helps to remember this isn't just a modern hobby with shaky footage and souvenir mugs. It's also a strand in a much older tapestry. And some strands are sacred, some are warnings, some are both. Here, by the fire, I want you to feel how easily the modern and the ancient can touch. Listen to the logs shift. Hear that tiny pop, like a seed breaking open. Notice how the candle flame leans when a draft slips through the room. Even indoors, even safe, the night presses gently at the windows. Now imagine that same draft, but outside, in a real forest. Wind slides through branches and makes them rub together with a dry, hushed rasp, like old pages turning. The smell of cedar rises. The ground is soft with needles. You step, and the earth gives a little, accepting your weight, recording you. That recording is part of what draws people to the Bigfoot story. The idea that the ground remembers. A footprint, after all, is the earth saying, something was here. When the print is too large, too human-shaped, too strange, it feels like the earth is whispering a secret it shouldn't know. But secrets are fragile. Rain comes, leaves fall, animals pass. The print softens, blurs at the edges, then becomes nothing again. And the witness is left with the most unreliable evidence of all: memory. Memory is a tricky lantern. It lights what it wants. It exaggerates shadows. It forgets details that matter and clings to details that don't. That's why, when we reach the famous cases later, you'll hear contradictions. You'll hear measurements that drift, descriptions that change, confidence that swells with retelling. It's human. It's almost tender. And it's also why skeptics sigh. Still, even skeptics sometimes admit something quietly. The wilderness is vast. There are places on the map that look like simple green patches until you step into them and realize they are worlds. They have their own weather, their own moods. They can swallow a sound and keep it. So if you've never walked alone in deep woods at night, let me lend you the feeling in a gentle way. Imagine your flashlight batteries are not new. The beam has a slight yellow tint, like old paper. It reaches maybe 20 feet with confidence. Beyond that, it fades into a soft gray uncertainty. You step over a fallen log. The bark is damp and spongy, and your palm touches it for balance. It leaves a cold smear on your skin, a reminder that trees are living things even after they fall. Your boot sinks into moss. It makes no sound, and that silence feels louder than a crunch. Your thoughts try to wander to ordinary places, laundry, bills, tomorrow's errands. They keep sliding back. Out here, the mind is pulled toward the present with a firm hand. Out here, you notice how your heart has its own rhythm, how it doesn't always match your calm voice. And in that present, you might notice a smell that doesn't belong. Not the clean smell of pine, not the green smell of wet leaves. Something stale, something animal. It could be a bear. It could be a dead thing. It could be nothing at all. But your spine reacts as if it is something. That reaction is ancient. Older than documentaries, older than the word Bigfoot. It reminds the body we are not always the biggest out there. The mountains arrive first in your imagination, as a pale line, a simple sketch on the horizon. But if you stay with the image long enough, the line becomes a wall, and the wall becomes a world. I want you to picture the Himalayas at night, not as a postcard, but as a living thing. Snowfields stretch like folded linen under the moon. The wind moves across them and makes a sound so fine it's almost not sound at all, more like pressure, more like the hush you feel when you press your ear to a seashell. Breathing there is work. Each inhale feels thin, as if the air has been watered down. Your chest rises anyway. The body insists on life. And when you exhale, the breath leaves you in a slow cloud that drifts away like a thought you didn't mean to share. In those heights, for centuries, people spoke of a being that lived with the glaciers. Not a carnival monster, not a joke. A presence treated with reverence, a protective nature spirit, a guardian folded into ice and stone. The old stories, in their oldest shape, don't always say ape. They say something closer to keeper, a watcher of passes, a spirit of white silence. And I always feel a little ache when I think about that, honestly, because the modern world loves to take a sacred thing and pin it down like a specimen. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. A story shifts the way a glacier shifts slow, heavy, almost imperceptible, and then suddenly the landscape looks different. At some point, the idea of the Yeti began to tilt from spirit toward creature, and in the telling of one old tale, a conqueror, Alexander the Great, heard rumors of wild, hairy giants in the mountains when he invaded the Indian subcontinent in 326 BCE. He demanded to see one. I can almost hear the impatience in that demand. A man who had crossed deserts and rivers and battlefields, convinced the world should open like a door for him. But the mountain people refused. They told him, gently or firmly, depending on the version, that if such beings were captured, they would not survive at lower altitudes. Whether that detail is history or myth doesn't matter as much as the feeling it carries. The idea that some things belong to a place so completely that removing them is a kind of killing. When I think about it, I picture a small village clinging to a slope, stone houses, low roofs weighted with snow, smoke rising from a chimney and flattening under the wind. Inside, hands are warmed around bowls of tea that smell faintly of butter and salt. Outside, prayer flags snap and flutter, their colors muted in the moonlight, sending wishes into the thin air. Above the village, the trail climbs. It narrows into a ribbon of packed snow, edged by rock that feels black and ancient. Each step crunches. The sound is crisp, clean, almost satisfying, until you realize it carries. In the open, sound travels like gossip. A traveler pauses and looks back at the village light's tiny, fragile dots. Then the traveler looks forward into the darkness and feels the familiar human thought. I am small. That smallness is the soil where wild man stories grow. In places where the land is bigger than you, your mind reaches for company, even if the company it imagines is frightening. The Yeti story spread through neighboring regions, braided into Buddhist mythology in some tellings. There was a belief in certain traditions that seeing one would be bad luck. So for a long time, people didn't go looking. They avoided the search the way you avoid stepping on a grave. Then, in the early 1800s, European outsiders began climbing, measuring, naming, planting flags. They wrote in journals with stiff handwriting, describing tracks and shadows and strange sights as if the mountains were a puzzle meant for them. And here is where I always feel that uneasy twist. The same landscape can be home to one person and an expedition to another. Reports accumulated through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, footprints, stories, sightings attributed to explorers and reconnaissance teams. A newspaper story gave the being a catchy New English name, the Abominable Snowman. It's a name that makes me wince, just a little. It sounds like a sideshow. It sounds like something you throw at a legend to make it fit your language. Still, names stick. And once a name sticks, it begins pulling new stories toward it, like iron filings toward a magnet. Now, let's drift lower, toward the forests of India, where heat gathers under leaves and insects sing all night. In some accounts, people spoke of Goliath-sized hairy humanoids in the high Himalayas of northeast India, another thread in the same tapestry. And in those humid forests, the line between animal we haven't catalogued and spirit we must respect can blur in the mind. When a foreign traveler hears a local tale, something quiet and dangerous can happen. The traveler retells it, and the retelling grows sharper teeth. Details inflate. Fear becomes entertainment. You've seen it happen, even in modern life, how a rumor spreads online, how each share adds a little spice, a little certainty. Human beings love certainty, even if the certainty is wrong. So, in the Yeti's case, a guardian of glaciers slowly became a beast in popular imagination. Not because the mountain people changed their hearts overnight, but because outsiders carried the story away and set it down in new places where it behaved differently. I want to slow down again and let you feel the pace of that change. Picture a single footprint in fresh snow. It's deep, round at the heel, long at the toes. The edges are sharp because the snow is new. The print is so clear it feels like a statement. A local herder sees it and bows their head slightly, maybe out of fear, maybe out of respect, maybe both. They change their path. They do not follow. The mountain has its own rules, and the herder knows them the way you know the rules of your own home. An outsider sees the same print and feels a different hunger. They lean close. They measure. They photograph. They imagine headlines. They imagine fame. Their breath fogs the air above the print, and for a moment, the print is hidden, then revealed again, as if it is playing with them. Two people, one footprint, two worlds. And this is not only the story of the Yeti, it is a pattern we will see again and again as we move toward the modern Bigfoot. A local, meaningful figure, lifted out of its context, turned into a question for outsiders to chase. If your mind is drifting, that's perfect. Let it drift. Let the snowfields blur into soft white. Let the wind become a steady hush. Let the idea of a watcher in the glacier settle in the back of your mind like a calm, cold stone. Because from here, we can begin to see how the world is full of wild men. Long before anyone said the word Bigfoot, and those older figures, half human, half nature, sometimes wise, sometimes violent, will lead us gently, step by step, toward the North American forests, where the story becomes loud in newspapers and quiet in the trees. Now, without rushing, let's cross an ocean in your mind. Imagine the southern hemisphere, a land where the night smells different eucalyptus, dry dust, the sharp green of leaves crushed underfoot. In Australia, Aboriginal stories spoke of reclusive hairy beings with many names, Quincan, Jugabina figures that could be shy or aggressive, or simply present in the bush like a difficult weather. Much later, long after those stories had been living in breath and gesture, a tabloid article in the 20th century claimed the first sighting had been in 1795, and an 1842 journal article referred to a hideous monster of an unearthly character and ape-like appearance. Even the phrasing feels like a stage curtain being pulled open. Hideous, unearthly. Words can turn a caution into a spectacle. I always picture the writer of that 1842 piece sitting at a desk, ink staining their fingertips, their candle sputtering as if it dislikes the sentence being formed. Outside, perhaps, the night is ordinary. A dog barks, a kettle cools, and yet, on paper, the bush becomes a theater, and the unknown becomes a devil. They even used a name like that Yahoo Devil in some retellings. The origin of the generic label, Yowie, is unclear, and that uncertainty itself is telling. When outsiders label something, the label often slides over the surface and misses the deeper meaning underneath. A sacred warning becomes a catchy word. A place-based spirit becomes a traveling monster, and then there's an even broader figure that keeps walking through human history in different masks, the wild man. That phrase sounds simple, almost lazy, but the idea behind it is old enough to have dust on its bones. It holds unkempt hermits and misunderstood animals and mythic monsters all in the same rough basket. It is what people imagine when they stand at the edge of civilization and look outward. One of the oldest written wild figures is Enkidu, from the ancient Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, a being of nature, a lone wanderer, hair and strength, and untamed life. When I read passages like that, I feel the centuries collapse. I can almost hear the scratching of reeds on clay, the careful pressing of signs into wet tablets, as if the writer knew they were trapping a dream in a solid thing. In the 5th century BCE, Herodotus described wild men in western Libya. His words travel to us across time like a whisper through a long hallway. Around that same era, a Greek physician wrote about India in a book called Indica, a text filled with dubious wonders, unicorns, and impossibilities, and yet the wild men in that distant land captured readers' attention. There's a soft problem here that matters, and I want to say it plainly, in a gentle way. Historical writings about wild men are often tangled with prejudice, with the idea that civilized people are the center of the world, and everything beyond them is exotic, dangerous, lesser. Those old pages can carry beauty and harm in the same breath. It's the same pattern we noticed in the mountains. A traveler arrives, sees something they don't understand, and writes it down in a way that makes them feel superior or safe. Sometimes, they might even be describing real animals, apes we now know, creatures that were astonishing to someone who had never seen them. The mystery then isn't a monster, it's unfamiliar life. A Carthaginian explorer, Hanno the Navigator, wrote of encountering hair-covered men and women on the West African coast, calling them gorilli, a name that would eventually be used for modern gorillas. Later, Pliny the Elder wrote in his sprawling natural history about fur-coated, fanged creatures in India that resembled humans but could not speak. Maybe he was imagining. Maybe he was repeating rumors. Maybe he was describing gibbons. Even when the facts are unclear, the human impulse is bright and constant, to fill the wilderness with figures. In medieval Europe, the wild man moved from pages into images, engravings, tapestries, stained glass. Sometimes he was dangerous, sometimes oddly admired, a symbol of what polite society feared and secretly envied. Freedom from rules, freedom from shame, freedom from being watched by neighbors. There are stories of kings cursed into madness, wandering the wilderness until they perish. There are poets who speak of wild men gifted with prophecy, as if losing society opened a door to another kind of sight. The wilderness, in these tales, is both punishment and revelation. If you let these threads gather Enkidu, the mountain watcher, the bush spirit, the medieval wild man, you begin to see why the modern Bigfoot story feels strangely familiar, even to people who've never stepped into the Pacific Northwest. It is not one creature. It is a recurring shape in the human mind. And still, the details matter. The details are where a place speaks. So let's return, just for a moment, to the Himalayas and feel a single detail as if it were happening now. A rope creaks under a gloved hand. Ice crystals sparkle on the fabric. A climber's eyelashes gather frost. The climber stops because the wind is changed. Not louder, just angled, as if it has found a new corridor. Down the slope, in a shallow drift, there are marks. Not a neat line of prints like in cartoons. Something messy, half a step, a drag, a scuff where snow was kicked aside to reveal rock beneath, dark as old blood. The climber's stomach tightens, then loosens, then tightens again. Not terror, a kind of awe. A local guide might look once and say a word that means, essentially, not ours, not for us to chase, not for us to disturb. And the climber, if they are wise, will listen. They will let the marks be marks and keep walking. That choice, whether to follow or to turn away, sits at the center of this entire sleepy history. Because in the modern era, so many people choose to follow. They follow with cameras, with casts of footprints, with late-night radio shows, with websites stacked with testimonies. They follow because they want the wild to prove itself. In the next part of our journey, we'll begin to drift toward the North American coast, where indigenous nations carried their own ancient stories of shape-shifting beings, not always animals, not always creatures, but spirits that could step between realms. And from that sacred ground, a modern word will rise. Bigfoot. Ink dries. Snow falls. The world keeps its secrets, and we keep listening, softly, for a while. We have been drifting across the world like a slow cloud, letting mountain snow and old ink settle on our eyelids. Now the air changes. You can feel it before you can name it. It becomes damp, salty, the kind of damp that makes wood smell sweeter and makes moss look almost black. The Pacific Northwest has that particular softness, as if the land has been breathing in rain for thousands of years and never quite exhaled it. If you close your eyes, you can imagine the soundscape right away. The steady hush of distant surf, the long whisper of wind in cedar tops, a raven somewhere, calling once, then going quiet, as if it has remembered a rule. And this is where I want to slow down and be careful, because the modern word Bigfoot is loud, and it can trample things that deserve to be approached gently. Long before newspaper headlines and roadside gift shops, there were nations living with these forests as a relative, not a resource. Their stories were not puzzles meant for outsiders to solve. They were law, memory, and sometimes warning, carried in voices around winter fires, carried in gestures, carried in the way a person learns where not to walk when the light is thin. On the West Coast, many First Nations have long established traditions about reclusive, towering beings, figures often spoken of with a kind of measured respect. The name Sasquatch itself is often connected to these older languages and older understandings, though details shift from place to place, as living stories always do. One group that is often mentioned in modern retellings are the Stolo people of the Fraser Valley region, whose connection to their lands stretches back into deep time. Some accounts describe a category of shape-shifting spirits, beings that can move between forms, between the seen and the unseen, between the physical world and something that sits just behind it like a second layer of air. I always feel a strange tenderness when a culture describes a being as capable of changing into a rock, a tree, even another animal. It tells you something about how they see the world, not as rigid boxes, not as human versus not human, but as a living continuum where spirit and matter can braid together. And if that is true, if a being can step sideways into stone or wood, then you begin to understand why the searchers never catch it. A hunter can track a deer because a deer is only a deer. But how do you hunt something that can become part of the forest itself? How do you pin down a story that was never meant to be pinned? This is where the modern chase begins to feel almost misguided. Not evil, just hungry in the wrong way. Like someone trying to hold water in their fist. Still, the stories persist, and not all are gentle. Not all are guardians. Indigenous North America is vast, and so is its mythology. Some traditions speak of helpful protectors of nature, beings that punish disrespect, that push back when humans become greedy or careless. Some speak of hostile wilderness figures, stealers, tricksters, dangerous presences that whistle to lead travelers astray. When you listen to that range, you realize something important. The forest was never only peaceful. It has always been a place where you can be fed, and a place where you can be taken. A place where you can feel held, and a place where you can be swallowed. Let me paint you a night that could belong to a story like that. A village sits near a river. The river is not a simple ribbon of water. It is wide, cold, muscular. It carries the smell of stones and silt. It speaks in a language of constant motion. Shh, shh, never exactly the same. Always steady enough to become hypnotic. In the longhouse, a fire burns low, not roaring, just glowing. Smoke curls toward the roof and finds its way out through gaps like a slow prayer. People sit close, knees tucked, blankets pulled up. Outside, rain taps the cedar planks with patient fingers. A child leans against an elder. The child's eyelids are heavy, but curiosity keeps them open a little longer. The elder's voice is soft, roughened by age, like bark. They speak of a being that lives where the trees grow so thick that daylight struggles. They don't say it like a dare. They say it like a fact of geography, like saying the river bends here, the mountain rises there. They describe footprints that appear where no one has walked. They describe a smell that arrives before the thing is seen. Musky, sour, the scent of wet fur and damp earth. They describe a sound that is not quite a scream, not quite a howl, something that climbs up the spine and makes a person freeze. Listening, listening. Then the elder adds the part that matters most. If you meet it, you do not mock it. You do not chase it for sport. You do not follow it into its own country. You show respect. You turn away. You go home. The child nods, half asleep, absorbing the rule the way you absorb warmth through skin. Years later, that child will be an adult who steps into the forest with those rules already living in their bones. Now, when modern culture tells the Bigfoot story, it often forgets this. For many communities, the creature is not a creature. It is a presence, a category, a neighbor in another register of reality. Some traditions speak of it as a protector, some as a danger, some as both, depending on how humans behave. And this is where the story becomes dark in a quiet way, because it mirrors something about us. Colonizers arrived, loggers arrived, prospectors arrived, roads were cut, trees fell, rivers were redirected. The forest, which had been a home full of rules and relationships, became a site of extraction. If a guardian being existed in the stories, if it was imagined as pushing back against disrespect, then of course new stories would grow where camps were disturbed, where equipment was smashed, where intruders felt watched. You can almost feel the tension in the air of those early encounters. Not a monster hunting humans for fun, but a wilderness saying, in its own blunt language, enough. There are accounts, too, of beings like the Wendigo in Algonquian traditions, figures associated with hunger, winter, and a kind of moral horror. And there are stories of coastal beings that lure travelers with offerings, drawing them toward the shadows. There are tales of fierce, wild figures, more bear-like than man-like. The names differ, the details differ, but the lesson is often similar. The wilderness has faces, and not all of them smile. As we gather these threads, the modern figure of Bigfoot starts to look less like a singular animal and more like a mask that different cultures have seen in different light, a mask that later outsiders would pick up and wear, sometimes without understanding its weight. And then, slowly, the modern world adds its own tools: newspapers, photographs, casts of tracks, television shows, debates, skeptics, believers. But for now, stay with me in the older hush. Imagine walking along the edge of a reservation at dusk. The sky is a bruised purple, fading into deep blue. The trees are silhouettes, tall, straight, unbothered. The air smells like wet soil and cedar resin. Your boots sink slightly in mud that holds the imprint of your tread. You come to a clearing where the ground is softer. There are tracks there, large, wide, human-shaped in the roughest way, but not human in scale. The toes are not delicate. They are heavy, as if the maker does not tiptoe through life. Your flashlight beam shakes a little. You swallow. Your throat feels dry even in the damp air. You want to tell yourself it's a bear print distorted by melting, by time, by imagination. Your mind reaches for comfort, and yet the print sits there like a sentence. You look up instinctively because something in you believes the maker might be watching. The trees hold their silence. A droplet falls from a branch and lands on your cheek, cold as a small coin. You wipe it away. Your fingers smell faintly of pine. In that moment, you understand why so many people return to these stories. They are not only about a creature. They are about the feeling of being small in a world that does not revolve around you. And perhaps that is why, even today, some traditions say the being walks in two realms: spiritual and physical, seen and unseen, a shifter, a boundary. If that is true, then the wilderness is not empty. It is populated, not by monsters waiting to pounce, but by presences that remind us we are guests. And there is another detail that often gets lost when people tell these tales in the excited tone of a campfire dare. In many traditions, what matters is not the proof, but the relationship. A footprint is not evidence first. It is a message. It is the forest leaving a mark to say, I was here. I am still here. Walk with care. Some elders describe the being as shy, almost painfully private. Others describe it as quick to anger if mocked. A few stories speak of it stealing food, salmon taken from a rack, berries missing from a basket, small thefts that feel like a reminder, not a crime. And then there are tales where the loss is not small at all, where a traveler follows a whistle, steps off a familiar path, and does not return. Those are the stories that parents tell softly, not to entertain, but to keep children alive. You know that feeling, don't you? When a warning is delivered without shouting. When someone says, don't go there. And you can hear the history inside those 3 words. In coastal Oregon, in some recorded traditions, wild men appear near villages, leaving tracks at the edge close enough to be noticed, far enough to remain unchallenged. Plateau tribes have spoken of hostile beings as a general group, figures believed to steal salmon or mislead people with whistling. Even the way the warning is shaped: sound, track, absence feels like a wilderness intelligence. And I'll admit something, honestly. Whenever I read a modern investigation that marches in with measuring tapes and plaster casts, I feel a little uneasy. Not because measuring is wrong, but because the forest has its own etiquette. If you enter a quiet room and start yelling questions, the room does not answer. It simply becomes colder. This is also where the story touches a darker history we can't ignore. The way outsiders have often written about wild men in terms loaded with prejudice, as if wilderness equals uncivilized. as if unfamiliar landscapes exist to be conquered. It's worth noticing. It's worth letting that discomfort sit beside the fascination, like two stones in your palm. Sometimes, on certain nights, people say they hear a heavy tread in the distance. Not close, not threatening, just there. A slow, deliberate walking, as if something large is moving between trunks without breaking branches, without hurrying. They'll tell you about dogs that refuse to leave the porch, tails tucked, ears low, eyes fixed on darkness that seems thicker than it should be. They'll tell you about a sudden silence, the kind that makes even insects stop their tiny music. And then, just as suddenly, everything resumes. A frog croaks, a leaf falls, the river keeps speaking. No body is found, no photo is taken, no trophy is carried home. Only the feeling remains, pressed into memory like a thumbprint in clay. And now, as the world of paper records and newspapers draws closer, you can sense the change in tone already. The older stories are like cedar smoke. The newer ones are like gunpowder. The older ones ask for respect. The newer ones demand proof. So keep your shoulders loose. Let your jaw unclench. Let the firelight in your mind flicker slowly. If you like, imagine the boundary where a gravel road ends and the real forest begins. Tires stop. Voices fade. You step past a rusted gate and your breath turns visible in the cool air. Ferns brush your shins, leaving beads of water on your skin. Somewhere far off, a branch cracks not loud, just definite. You pause, listening to your own heartbeat, and you understand why a single unseen presence can feel larger than any proof. The mind hates that pause and tries to fill it with certainty. If you leave it alone, it becomes calming, like inhale that doesn't rush out. We will soon move into the written records of settlers and the early sightings cataloged by later researchers. Those accounts will be messy, sometimes arrogant, sometimes frightened, sometimes strangely sincere. They will also show the moment when a sacred, local idea begins to be dragged into the bright, noisy arena of modern curiosity. For now, just listen to the rain. Let it tap the roof in your mind. Let it run down bark. Let it gather in the low places of the earth, making shallow puddles that reflect the faintest slice of moon. In that reflection, for a second, you might think you see a tall shape at the tree line, and then you blink, and it's only trees. Or maybe it isn't. The older stories linger in the air as we step forward in time, and you can almost hear the moment when paper begins to replace breath. It's a curious thing, honestly. A spoken story can flex and breathe with the room. A written story sits still. It waits. It can be carried far from the place it was born, far from the people who know how to hold it properly. When settlers and travelers began writing down what they thought they saw, the tone changed. The forest was no longer a relative. It became a backdrop, a stage, sometimes an enemy. And so, the earliest Bigfoot sightings that later researchers tried to catalog often read like little lantern flashes in the dark, brief, uneven, smudged by fear, pride, or the desire to be believed. One well-known attempt to gather them into an organized list came in the early 1980s, when compilers tried to arrange reports chronologically across the United States. When you look at those lists, the surprising detail is how scattered the stories are. Not only the Pacific Northwest, Maine, New York, Arkansas, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Oklahoma, places that don't fit the neat modern stereotype. To me, that scattered map is soothing in a strange way. It reminds you how myths travel through minds, not just through geography. A single idea, hairy, upright, watchful, can sprout wherever forest and loneliness overlap. Sometimes I imagine one of those compilers sitting at a kitchen table late at night, lamplight pooling on paper. The house is quiet. A refrigerator hums. Outside the window, there might be a small stand of trees. Nothing like the primeval forests of legend, yet still enough to make the darkness feel alive. They turn pages slowly, listening to the soft rasp of paper against paper. Maine, early 1800s. New York, another date. Arkansas, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Oklahoma. Each entry is a tiny doorway, and behind each doorway is a person who swore they saw something tall and hairy moving between trunks. A person who heard a scream that didn't sound like any fox or owl. A person who woke to find prints by the creek where no one should have been walking. A compiler can't smell that night. They can't taste the fear. All they can do is underline names and locations and try to hold chaos in a grid. And even the grid is imperfect. Because eyewitness memory is a restless thing. It edits itself. It protects itself. It turns a fleeting shadow into a certainty. Or it turns a certainty into a half-whisper years later when no one wants to be laughed at. So when we move through these early reports, I like to do it with a softer posture, not grabbing for verdicts, just listening. Back at Mount Shasta, for example, the men would have been living with a constant scrape of hardship even before any giant appeared. Their hands cracked from cold, their nails packed with grit, their shoulders aching from hauling, digging, lifting. They slept in clothes that never quite dried, and when they woke, the inside of their mouths tasted like smoke and tin and stale coffee. If something did come to the edges of their camp, if something large did move in the tree line, you can imagine how their exhausted minds would frame it. The darkness already felt hostile. The mountain already felt indifferent. A heavy footstep would land on that fear like a stamp on wax. In the Roosevelt tale, too, I can't help picturing the small domestic details that never make it into the heroic summary. The way a trapper's hands shake slightly when he pours coffee in the morning. The way the smell of damp leather clings to everything. The way your skin prickles when you realize someone or something has been touching your possessions in the night. It's not only the death that haunts a camp, it's the intimacy of the intrusion. The wilderness doesn't just threaten from afar. Sometimes it reaches into your bag, your blanket, your sense of safety, and rearranges it. You lie awake afterward, staring into blackness, and the smallest creak of wood sounds like a slow, deliberate step still. There are moments in the record that feel like heavy stones you can't ignore. One of them takes us to California in the year 1850, to Mount Shasta, where prospectors and miners were chewing at the land with the restless hunger of a gold rush. Picture it slowly. A camp sits in the shadow of enormous slopes. The mountain is a presence more than a landmark, its peak often hidden in cloud, its flanks dark with conifers. The air at night grows thin and sharp. Flames in a campfire seem too bright, too eager, because the surrounding darkness is so complete. Men in rough clothes move through that darkness with a kind of bravado that doesn't quite cover their fear. Boots crunch on gravel, tin cups clink. There's the smell of sweat, smoke, and damp wool. In the distance, an owl calls, and it sounds like a question no one wants to answer. Then, according to later retellings, something begins to harass the camp. Cabins are struck. Equipment is smashed. Tracks appear. A story circulates of hairy giants with long arms and short legs. In one vivid image, a massive section of a sluiceway, wood meant to guide water and gravel, gets lifted and broken against a tree as if it were kindling. Whether that happened exactly as told is hard to know. What matters for the myth is the feeling that the land itself has teeth and that the men chewing at it might be chewed back. If you've ever been in a remote place at night, you know how quickly the mind starts painting shapes at the edge of firelight. Shadows stretch, branches sway, a gust of wind can sound like footsteps. The nervous system becomes a storyteller all on its own. And yet, the miners were not the only ones telling stories. Decades later, President Theodore Roosevelt included a tale in his book about wilderness hunting, an anecdote about a trapper named Bowman and a companion camping near the borderlands of Idaho and Montana, in the mountains near the Wisdom River. The way Roosevelt tells it, the men leave camp for a time, and when they return, everything has been rifled, possessions scattered, a feeling of violation hanging in the air, like smoke that won't clear. Tracks in the dirt suggest the intruder walked upright, two-legged, almost human, almost. Then the harassment continues. Break-ins, disturbances, nights where sleep is thin and twitchy, where every crackle of fire sounds like a warning. Eventually, Bowman finds his companion dead, and the ground around the body is crowded with tracks. That is the dark heartbeat of so many frontier tales, isn't it? The wilderness as a place where people vanish, where bodies appear in the morning with no clean explanation, where fear becomes a kind of companion you sleep beside. You can also feel, under the surface, a different story trying to speak. From an indigenous perspective, some of these attacks on camps and equipment can be read as a protective response, nature, or a guardian of nature, pushing back against intrusion. The miners and trappers see aggression. The land, in another telling, sees defense. Two narratives staring at each other across the same set of footprints, and that tension between exploitation and protection, between arrogance and reverence, will keep returning as we move forward. Now, let your mind drift to the year 1924, Washington State, Mount Street Helens. Before the famous eruption, before the mountain's face was torn open in modern footage, it stood like a brooding giant, thick with forest and snowmelt and long, quiet gullies. 5 men, gold miners again, are tucked into a rough cabin near what will later be called Ape Canyon. The name itself already feels like a story half written in advance, doesn't it? As if the landscape is waiting for the right rumor to stain it. Imagine the cabin in detail. Hand-cut boards, gaps where wind finds a way in, a door that sticks slightly, swollen by damp. The inside smells of pitch, smoke, old coffee, and unwashed bodies. Blankets are thin. The floor is gritty with tracked-in dirt. Tools lean against a wall like tired metal limbs. Outside, the night is enormous. The forest is not a flat silence. It is layered. There's the faint hiss of wind high in the branches. There's the soft drip of water from needles. There's the tiny scurry of something small in the underbrush. And then there is the deeper quiet underneath it all, a kind of listening quiet, as if the mountain is paying attention. According to the miners' later report, one of them, Fred Beck, in the version that would be written down years later, sees a tall, upright, hairy figure near the cabin. He fires a shot. The figure runs. That single gunshot is like a spark in dry grass. It doesn't just pierce the air, it changes it. After the shot, every sound becomes suspicious. Every shadow becomes a possibility. The men talk too loudly at first, trying to laugh off what happened. Then their voices lower. Then they stop talking altogether, because the silence outside feels heavier than their words. Night deepens. The fire burns down to coals. The cabin creaks as it cools, boards contracting like bones settling. Someone coughs. Someone shifts on a bedroll. Someone stares at the ceiling and tries to pretend the pounding in their chest is normal. And then, they say, the attack begins. At first, it might sound like simple mischief, a thud against the cabin wall, a rock, a branch, something thrown. But it does not stop. Thud, thud, a heavier impact, something skittering off the roof. The sound of objects striking wood again and again, as if the night itself is pelting them with anger. The men bolt upright, hearts leaping. They fumble for rifles with numb fingers. The metal is cold, too cold, as if it has been sleeping in a river. They jam chairs against the door. They press their shoulders to the boards. They whisper curses, then stop whispering because the fear is already loud enough. Outside, they claim, there are multiple creatures, upright, enormous, moving in the dark, unseen, but felt through the force of what they throw. Rocks, chunks of wood, anything that can be lifted. The cabin shudders. Dust falls from rafters like a fine gray snow. One man's breath comes in sharp bursts. Another starts to pray. Another starts to laugh. Just once, a short, broken laugh that sounds almost like a sob, and then comes the part that later accounts repeat with a kind of grim fascination. The men fire their rifles, not in a careful line, not with aim. They shoot through the roof, through cracks, into darkness, as if noise itself might drive the attackers away. Gunshots crack and echo off trees, off canyon walls. Smoke blooms inside the cabin, thick and bitter. Ears ring. The smell of gunpowder mixes with the smell of wet wood, creating a scent that feels like panic. And yet, they claim, the attack continues, as if the bullets mean nothing. This detail, of course, strains belief. It is one of the reasons skeptics raise eyebrows. Still, the myth does not care about eyebrows. The myth cares about the feeling of helplessness men with guns, the supposed masters of wilderness, suddenly powerless inside a shaking wooden box. Eventually, the night loosens its grip, the throwing slows, the silence returns. But it is not comforting silence. It is the silence after a storm, when you know branches have fallen somewhere, and you'll only see the damage at dawn. Morning arrives, thin and gray. Mist clings to the ground. The men step outside, blinking, sore, stiff with sleeplessness. They see tracks, large ones, pressed into soft earth. They see debris. They see scuffs, where something heavy moved close to the cabin. And then, in Beck's later telling, there is a final encounter. One of the ape men appears, is shot, and topples into a gorge below, never to be found. That never to be found is the phrase that keeps returning through Bigfoot history like a refrain. Tracks, yes. Stories, yes. Fear, yes. Bodies, almost never. The men pack up. They leave. They go back toward civilization with the strange emptiness of survivors. No trophy, no proof. Only a memory that feels too big to fit in normal conversation. When they tell people, reporters come. Curious locals come. The story begins to spread, growing slightly larger each time it is retold, the way a shadow grows as a firelight shifts. And that is how the modern pattern takes shape. An incident, a rumor, a frenzy, investigators who find tracks and nothing else, believers who feel validated, skeptics who sigh. If you listen closely, you can hear the next chapter, already approaching on the wind stories, of kidnappings, of strange footprints on logging roads, of names, like Bluff Creek, that will become almost sacred to a certain kind of obsession. But for now, let Ape Canyon settle into your mind like a slow snowfall. A cabin, a mountain, a night full of thrown stones, and men trapped inside their own fear, listening to the wilderness knock. After Ape Canyon, the story doesn't calm down. It just changes its clothes. The mountain night with the thrown stones leaves behind a particular flavor in the legend. The idea that gunfire does not settle the matter, that tracks appear like signatures, and that the creature, if creature is even the right word, slips away with an ease that feels almost insulting to the human desire for closure. And then, the same year as that 1924 incident, another thread appears, softer in its violence, stranger in its intimacy. A man named Albert Ostman would later claim he was taken, not attacked, not chased, taken. I always pause on that, because an attack is easy for the mind to file away, under fear, under chaos. A kidnapping is different. It suggests purpose. It suggests hands that decide, and a path that is chosen, not stumbled into. Ostman's account wasn't told right away. He said he kept it quiet for years, and I can understand that silence. You know the feeling, don't you? When something happens that sounds impossible, And the first danger isn't the event itself, it's the faces of other people when you try to explain it. So imagine him, decades later, sitting in a plain room, perhaps with a cup of coffee that is cooled, telling the story in a voice that tries to stay steady. He was camping at Toba Inlet in British Columbia. The place itself is already half a dream. Water that cuts between steep, forested walls. Mist that clings low in the mornings. The kind of quiet where even your own footsteps on pine needles feel too loud, like you are interrupting something older than you. He had his sleeping bag, his supplies, the little rituals of someone settling in for a night outdoors, the careful choice of where to lay down, the way you test the ground with your palm, the small patting of pockets to confirm matches are there, knife is there, coffee is there. The familiar weight of gear that makes you feel prepared, like armor made of canvas and tin. Night comes. It always comes too quickly in thick forest. The sky above becomes a dark lid, and the treetops merge into a single mass, a silhouette that doesn't feel like individual trees anymore. It feels like a wall. Your breath turns visible for a moment, then disappears. You listen for bears. You listen for coyotes. You listen for the water moving against rocks. And then, he says, the ground shifts. Not in an earthquake way, in a presence way, a pressure, a heaviness near him, close enough that the air seems to thicken. Before he can sit up, before he can shout, he feels himself lifted, sleeping bag and all, as if he is not a grown man, but a bundle of cloth. Try to picture that, the helplessness of it, the way your body would slam against the inside of the bag, elbows and knees hitting fabric, your voice muffled by wool and fear. The smell inside the bag, old laundry, sweat, damp earth rushing into your nose as you struggle to breathe. He's carried. The motion is not gentle. It's not careful like a parent carrying a child. It's strong, efficient, impatient. Each step jolts him. His teeth click together. His stomach lurches. The world outside is a blur of darkness and muffled sound. Brush snapping, gravel sliding, the deep rhythmic thud of feet that don't trip, don't hesitate. Minutes feel long, the kind of long that stretches like taffy. He tries to count steps, then loses count. He tries to listen for direction, uphill, downhill, but panic makes the body stupid, and everything becomes only sensation. Then the movement stops. The air changes, less open, more enclosed, like being set down in a hollow, a natural amphitheater in the forest. He wriggles. He forces an arm free. The fabric scrapes his skin. Cold air hits his cheek. He pushes his head out like an animal emerging from a burrow. And there they are, he says. A family, not a single monster, not a lone prowler, a group, arranged with the casual closeness of relatives, a male, a female, a boy, a girl. He describes them as enormous, hairy, upright, faces that hover uncomfortably close to human without ever crossing the line into familiar. A smell in the air musky, animal, the scent of wet fur warmed by bodies, the kind of smell that clings to your tongue when you swallow. What does a person do in that moment? Fight? Plead? Pretend to be calm? Ostman's story leans toward the last one. He says he survived by not escalating, by watching, by waiting, by making himself small inside his own mind, even when his body was trembling. Days pass, he claims. He eats what he has, cold food, whatever can be managed. Coffee becomes more than a drink. It becomes a tiny ceremony of normalcy, a way to make the hands do something familiar, to keep panic from chewing through thought. He observes them, their movements, their sounds, the way they squat, the way they stand, the way they glance at one another, the way the young ones hover close to the adults. Little domestic details, the kind that make the story feel almost unbearable, because domesticity in the wrong place is frightening. It makes the unknown feel organized. At night, he tries to sleep, but sleep is thin. He lies there, listening. A twig snaps, a low murmur of breath, the distant drip of water, his own heartbeat thudding like a drum against his ribs. He thinks about home, about chairs, about walls that don't move, about the simple relief of a door that locks. And then, after several days, he says he escapes. The details vary depending on the retelling, but the shape is similar. A moment of distraction, a chance, a desperate decision. He moves, fast and quiet, because quiet can be a kind of prayer. He runs until his lungs burn. He runs until his legs become numb pillars. He runs through underbrush that claws at his clothes, through mud that tries to pull his boots off, through ferns that slap wet against his shins. When he finally finds civilization again, it feels unreal. Voices, straight lines, the smell of smoke from chimneys, the ordinary miracle of other humans walking around without fear. Some people said he wasn't a liar. Some interviewers never found a clean inconsistency. Skeptics, of course, raised their hands and pointed out how convenient it is that there is no proof beyond the tale itself. And that is the essential pattern again. An experience, a narrative, a lack of physical evidence. It is tempting to choose a side, to declare it true or false. But for the purpose of a sleep story, I find something quieter inside it. The story is, at its core, about captivity and about the strange discipline of staying calm when you are in a world that does not belong to you. If you've ever had a nightmare where you can't move, where your voice won't come out, you know the flavor of it. The body trapped, the mind racing, the need to survive by breathing slowly, by waiting for the moment when the dream loosens its grip. Ostman's account, whether literal or mythic, carries that same texture. And while it traveled by word of mouth and interviews, while it sat in the margins of newspapers and campfire talk, something else was happening in the wider Bigfoot timeline. The slow accumulation of reports, the little yearly drip of sightings that later compilers would list like beads on a string. People saw tall figures at the edge of headlights. People heard screams that made them pull blankets up to their chins, even indoors. People found tracks by creeks. They told friends, then stopped telling friends, because laughter can be sharper than fear. The legend kept breathing. By the time the mid-century arrived, it had enough oxygen to flare. And the flare would come not from a mountain canyon this time, but from a logging road, where wet earth holds impressions the way a memory holds a shock. We're almost there. Before we step into that moment, let your mind rest on Ostman's strange pocket of days in the forest. The way time would blur, the way daylight would filter through branches and pale stripes, the way every small sound would feel like a question. And notice this gentle, unsettling thought. In his story, the beings do not kill him. They do not devour him. They do not tear him apart. They simply keep him. That, somehow, can be scarier than teeth. First, I picture the mornings first, because mornings in the coastal forests of British Columbia can feel like the world is still half asleep. The light arrives reluctantly, washed thin by cloud, and the air is so damp it seems to have weight. If you inhale, you taste cedar. You taste the faint metallic bite of cold water nearby. Even the moss looks saturated, swollen, glossy, as if it has been drinking all night. Ostman would wake, if he woke at all. More likely, he drifted in and out, the way you do when you are waiting for danger to happen. A few minutes of sleep, a jerk awake, another few minutes, a thought that repeats like a slow chant. Stay quiet, stay quiet, stay quiet. He would listen for the family's movement before he dared to shift his shoulders. And when he did move, the smallest sound could feel enormous. The rasp of fabric, the soft squeak of a zipper, a tin cup tapping against a can. You know how loud those sounds become in the dark when you don't want them to be heard? In a city, they're nothing. Out there, they're flares. Sometimes, he said, they watched him, not the way a hunter watches prey, more like the way a child watches an unusual insect, curious and cautious, unsure whether it will sting. Their eyes, in his telling, weren't glowing or magical. They were simply eyes, dark, reflective, unreadable. That normality is what makes it creep in under the skin. He would look away at times, on purpose. There's an instinct in humans to avoid direct stare-downs with large animals. A part of the brain that understands, without words, that eye contact can be a challenge. So he kept his gaze soft. He let it slide to the side. He looked at the ground instead, at leaf litter and broken twigs, at the small architecture of the forest floor. The forest floor is never still. Even when everything seems silent, there's life shifting under it. Ants moving in patient lines. A beetle rolling itself over. A worm contracting and stretching. When you are afraid, focusing on tiny things can be a kind of medicine. It shrinks the horizon. It gives your mind a job. He would count his supplies again and again, not because the numbers changed, but because counting is a rope you can hold on to. 2 tins, a packet of biscuits, a little salt, coffee, matches, the comforting click of a lid. The way the smell of coffee grounds when the tin opens can make the heart slow down for a second. And the family, if we follow his story, had their own rhythms. The adults would leave at times and return. The young ones would linger, poking at objects, tilting their heads. There is something tender in that image, which is exactly why it feels dangerous. Tenderness in the wrong mouth can be a trap. At one point, he described the female as having breasts, like a human woman, and that detail always makes listeners shift in their beds. It collapses distance. It forces the mind to consider that whatever these beings are, they occupy the uncomfortable borderland between animal and almost us. He might have wondered about language, about whether they understood him, about whether the sounds they made to one another were words or merely calls. There's a loneliness in not knowing. The loneliness of being surrounded and still being unspeakably alone. And then there's the geography of captivity. Where were they holding him? A hollow, a sheltered basin, a natural pocket in the terrain. When you can't leave, the shape of your prison becomes intimate. You learn the angles. You memorize the way one route curves like a finger. You notice how the wind enters from one side and not the other. You notice where the light lands at noon and where it doesn't. The passing of time becomes a slow film. A gray morning becomes a slightly brighter afternoon. The sun never really breaks through. The sound of rain comes and goes, sometimes soft like whispering, sometimes sharp like handfuls of rice thrown against leaves. Drops gather on fir needles and fall in single, deliberate taps. Tap, tap, tap. In that tapping, you can almost fall asleep. That is the strange thing about fear. It is exhausting. It burns fuel. The body cannot stay in full alert forever. Eventually, even terror begins to feel routine. It settles into the muscles like a dull ache. Your mind starts to drift, not because the danger is gone, but because the brain needs rest to survive it. If Ostman was there for days, he would have reached that point. The point where the horror becomes, briefly, ordinary, where you can notice beauty even while trapped. A beam of light caught in mist, the scent of crushed fern when you shift your weight, the way a raven calls once, then goes quiet, as if embarrassed to have spoken, softly. The road is rough, freshly cut into the forest, like a wound that hasn't decided whether to heal or scar. It's 1958, and Bluff Creek in Northern California smells the way new logging sites always smell. Raw wood, crushed needles, diesel, wet soil turned over like dark bread. The air has that sharp sap sweetness that makes you think of Christmas trees. And then the engine fumes remind you, this is work, not a postcard. Men arrive early. Boots thud on planks. Tools clink. Someone spits into the mud and watches it disappear. A chainsaw coughs awake in the distance, then settles into a steady growl, the kind of sound that becomes background until you notice, suddenly, how it never truly stops. And on a road being cleared for timber operations, a man named Jerry Crew sees something that doesn't fit the day's logic. Footprints, huge ones, not the delicate, confusing mess of deer tracks, not the neat paired prints of a bear. These are impressions that look almost intentional. A heel, a broad midfoot, toes pressed into mud like blunt stamps. The earth holds them the way wax holds a seal. I want you to imagine the moment of recognition, the way a worker might stop mid-step, weight shifting, boot half raised, as his eyes catch the shape. The tiny pause where the mind tries to label what it is seeing. A joke, a prank, a misread, then the second print, then another. A line of them, spaced with the long stride of something tall. Mud gathers in the grooves. Water pools in the deepest parts. A thin film of surface water trembles when someone leans close. A fly lands, lifts off. Nothing feels supernatural. It feels ordinary, and that makes it worse, because the ordinary world is not supposed to accommodate something like this. The crew talks, low voices, half laughing, half wary. Someone measures with a tape. Someone squats and runs a finger along the edge of the impression, feeling how the mud crumbles, how it's real, how it is not a drawing. Word spreads, the way word always spreads, in small working communities. A thing you can't explain becomes a story you can share. It gives the day a strange flavor. It makes lunch break conversations more animated. It makes the long drive home feel like a corridor of dark trees watching you pass. And then the story leaves the forest. The Associated Press picks it up. Just like that, the footprints become a headline that can travel. They can leap across states. They can land on kitchen tables, beside coffee cups and newspapers, in towns where the wildest thing most people see is a raccoon in a trash can. The on-site crew calls the mysterious maker of the prints Bigfoot. A name is a spell. The moment you name something, you give it a shape that the public can hold. Bigfoot. It sounds half ridiculous, half perfect. It has the casual confidence of a nickname you'd give to a coworker. It has the simplicity of a child's drawing. It's easy to remember, easy to repeat, easy to print in bold letters, and it sticks. Scientists, at least at first, don't rush in. There's no stampede of professors in the mud. There are mostly reporters, curious locals, a few skeptics with raised eyebrows. People take photos. People argue about stride length. People talk about bears walking upright. People talk about pranksters. Meanwhile, the forest just keeps being itself. It rains. It dries. The mud hardens. Leaves fall into the impressions. The evidence, if it is evidence, begins to fade in the slow, patient way nature erases human excitement. Still, the name remains, and something quiet happens in American imagination. A creature that used to live in scattered tales, indigenous law, frontier whispers, campfire accounts, now has a modern brand. It has an address, Bluff Creek, Northern California, a place you can point to on a map. I always find this part oddly tender because it shows how easily we need a physical anchor for the unknown. A print in mud is enough. A photograph is enough. A rumor is enough if it arrives at the right moment. And 1958 was the right moment. The post-war world was buzzing with new media, new highways, new appetites for mystery. People were moving into suburbs and watching television and craving something that felt wild. Something that reminded them the world still had corners where you could get lost. The logs hauled out of these forests were feeding building booms, houses, schools, stores, civilization stacking itself higher. So when a giant footprint appeared on a logging road, it felt like the wilderness stamping its approval, or its warning. Years later, the story develops another twist, the way so many Bigfoot stories do. The children of a man named Ray Wallace would say their father made the tracks with large wooden feet as a joke, a prank that got out of hand. I can almost see that too. A man carving wood in a shed, smiling to himself, thinking he's about to give his coworkers a good scare. The smell of sawdust, the pleasure of planning something silly, the way harmless mischief can feel like a small rebellion against routine. Then the prank spreads. Reporters arrive. The name Bigfoot is born. And suddenly, the joke is no longer owned by the joker. It belongs to everyone. Michael Wallace, his son, would later say it wasn't some well-planned plot. It was just a joke. And then it took on a life of its own. And even now we can't stop it. That sentence has always haunted me in a gentle way, because it describes mythology itself. A small, human action. A story told once. A laugh. Then repetition. Then belief. Then culture. Then a creature that cannot be put back into the shed. Even if the Bluff Creek prints were faked, the hunger they fed was real. And once that hunger had a name, it began to pull in other stories like a tide pulling driftwood to shore. Loggers started telling tales as part of their occupational culture. Sightings were reported more often, not necessarily because the creature was suddenly more present, but because the idea of it was. People noticed shadows they might have ignored before. They heard a howl and thought, what if? They saw a movement in the trees and felt their spine tighten. Belief can sharpen perception. It can also warp it. The two are hard to separate when you're alone at night and the woods are breathing around you. Somewhere in the background, older indigenous meanings still existed, steady and quiet, like deep water under surface ripples. For some communities, the Sasquatch was not a tabloid monster, but a being woven into law, land, and story. Something with spirit, something that could protect, punish, or simply remain beyond human grasp. And then, in 1967, just about a decade after the Bluff Creek tracks exploded into public consciousness, two men would return to the same region with a camera, Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin. They set out into Northern California wilderness with the goal of filming a pseudo-documentary about an encounter with Bigfoot. Even that sentence feels like a wink. Going out to film something legendary is already half belief, half performance. The day they reported is almost cinematic. Dust on the road, a creek running low, the hush of late afternoon light. The kind of moment where the world looks staged even when it isn't. They claimed they came upon a massive, hairy, ape-like figure near Bluff Creek, about 38 miles south of the Oregon border. Patterson supposedly grabbed his camera in haste, chased on foot, and filmed a shaky clip that lasts less than a minute. Less than a minute, and yet it would shape decades. In the portion that can be made out, the figure strides away with an energetic gait and looks back, as if annoyed, as if offended, to be watched. That look back is the hook in the film. It's the moment people rewind. It's the moment skeptics squint. It's the moment believers lean in. A journalist named John O'Connor would later call that film the single most infamous and contested piece of Bigfoot evidence in existence. And contested is the right word, because the film doesn't simply show something. It invites argument. It creates a room where people can sit for hours and debate the angle of a knee, the swing of an arm, the shape of a shoulder. Critics raised doubts about inconsistencies in the men's accounts, about the creature's proportions, about whether it matched known scientific norms. Some pointed out that the footage is blurry, that human imagination fills in the missing detail. Still, the criticism didn't arrive instantly. At first, few scientists were interested at all. Some refused to even watch it. Others saw it and shrugged. The world was busy. The film was odd. But Patterson promoted it, and promotion matters. He took the story to the public until the public began to treat it as a pivot point. If not for that film, O'Connor suggested, Bigfoot might have faded into history's back pages. Instead, it walked into American vernacular, embodying something homespun and subversive. something that felt like the myth of America itself. I always feel a little shiver when someone says that, because myths aren't just about creatures, they're about us, about what we want the world to contain. The legend of Bigfoot shifted in those decades. It moved from rural folklore and indigenous storytelling into the realm of pseudoscience, the same crowded shelf where you'd find Atlantis and Loch Ness and other longing-shaped ideas. And in that realm, the hunt never truly ends. It can't. The chase is the point. Tonight, as you rest, we don't need to solve the mystery. We only need to walk alongside it, to let the woods be dark and vast, to let a single footprint in wet earth become a lullaby that repeats softly in the mind. Because somewhere between hoax and holiness, between prank and prophecy, Bigfoot continues to stride one heavy step at a time through the quietest parts of our imagination. I like to imagine the first times people watched that clip, not on crisp digital screens, not with pause buttons and high-definition zoom, but in rooms that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and hot dust from a projector lamp, a reel clicking, a fan humming, someone coughing into their hand. The film starting with a little jump, then settling into its jittery stride. For a few seconds, the forest fills the frame. Brush, light, movement that might be nothing. Then the figure appears, and you can almost feel the collective inhale, that shared human habit of leaning forward when something might matter. Someone says, "There," too loudly, then laughs at themselves. Someone else says nothing at all, because silence can be a shield when you don't want to commit to belief. The clip ends quickly. People ask to see it again. The projector rewinds with a soft, mechanical whine. The same few seconds repeat, like a charm being tested. In repetition, the mind begins to decorate. It adds weight. It adds intent. It adds story. This is the part where skeptics and believers begin to form tribes. It happens quietly, almost politely. At first, one person points out the sway of the hips. Another points out the length of the arms. A third person shakes their head and says, "It looks like a man in a suit." And the room reacts the way rooms always react when someone punctures a shared wonder. What kind of suit, though? People argued about that too. They argued about what special effects could and couldn't do in the 1960s. They compared it to movies of the era. They brought up apes on film, astronauts, monsters, all the ways humans have always used costumes to give shape to fear and fascination. And yet the film's power remained, because it was simple. It didn't show a clear face. It didn't offer a tidy explanation. It held just enough detail to keep the argument alive, and just enough blur to keep certainty away. That is a perfect recipe for a modern legend. The argument itself became part of the story. The contested nature became fuel, because if something is too easily proven false, it dies quickly. If something is too easily proven true, it becomes ordinary. Bigfoot lives in the narrow, shadowed hallway between those two doors. As the years passed, the creature settled deeper into culture. It appeared on posters, in jokes, in roadside gift shops. It became something you could buy on a t-shirt, which is a strange fate for a being that is supposed to avoid human contact. Still, belief persisted. Not always loud belief. Sometimes it was the quiet kind. The kind that shows up when someone is driving a forest road alone at night and suddenly turns the radio down, as if sound might attract something. The kind that shows up when a child asks, with a seriousness that surprises you, if monsters are real, and you hesitate before answering. Let the last image be mud holding a print and a camera holding a blur. Feel the hush between them. That hush is where our story rests, and where it will wander next. Close your eyes, slowly. Now, the myth keeps walking, even when the road becomes asphalt, even when the woods are carved into neat rectangles on a surveyor's map. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Bigfoot is no longer only a campfire rumor or a single shaky reel of film. It becomes a kind of national itch, something people scratch with magazines, with late-night radio, with paperback books whose covers promise secrets in bold, hungry letters. And the decade itself, it matters. The 1970s carried a particular mood, a haze of distrust, a fascination with hidden things. People talked about the Bermuda Triangle the way they used to talk about haunted houses. Atlantis drifted through dinner table conversation like a lost perfume. Conspiracy stories weren't only fringe. They were entertainment, and sometimes they were comfort. When the world feels complicated, a mystery you can hold in your hands feels strangely soothing. So Bigfoot fits. You can almost hear the sound of it. The click of a cassette being inserted into a player. The slow whir of tape. A radio host lowering his voice, as if speaking softly might coax the creature closer. And somewhere out beyond the reach of the streetlights, the forest remains dark, patient, indifferent. One man, in particular, leans into that darkness with an almost tender seriousness. Peter Byrne, once described as a former Yeti hunter, sets up what becomes known as a Bigfoot Information Center, a place that feels half like a museum and half like a shrine. I always imagine the walls lined with photographs and hand-drawn maps, cabinets with plaster casts of footprints, white and heavy as loaves of bread, a faint smell of paper and dust and old coffee, people stepping inside, brushing rain from their jackets, blinking under fluorescent light that makes everything look a little more tired than it really is. Byrne is a believer in the Patterson-Gimlin film, not in a casual way, not in a maybe way, in a way that moves a person to act. In 1976, he collects hair samples from a site connected to 2 recent sightings and sends them to the FBI for analysis. That choice still feels strange to me in a quiet, human way, because it carries hope. It carries the desire to hand mystery to an authority and say, please, tell us what this is. Make it real or make it stop. The FBI, despite saying they aren't in the business of examining such evidence, responds. They look at the hairs. Their pronouncement is blunt. Deer. Just deer. No roaring headline. No monster. Just an ordinary animal whose fur has been living in these woods for as long as the woods have been here. And yet, the story doesn't die. That's the thing. A skeptic might think deer hair would end it, like blowing out a candle. But myth isn't a candle. It's more like embers. You can stomp on them and still, later, find warmth. Bigfoot keeps migrating into pop culture. It shows up as mascots, as jokes, as children's characters that are friendly and a little clumsy. It appears in shows and films, sometimes scary, sometimes sweet. People who grew up in the 1970s and 1980s remember it like a familiar face that never quite belonged to anyone. There's something oddly gentle about that transformation. A creature that began as a shadow in indigenous law and frontier fear becomes a plush toy, a tourist attraction, a smiling silhouette on a roadside sign. But underneath the smiles, there's still a question that keeps breathing. What if it's real? Polls and studies try to measure belief the way you might measure rainfall. One study in 2006 suggested a notable portion of Americans believed Bigfoot absolutely or probably existed. A later poll suggested a similar appetite for cryptids among Canadians. Numbers like that don't prove anything about the creature, of course, but they do reveal something about us. We like to leave a door open, even if only a crack. And then there's science. Science has its own kind of lullaby. It speaks in protocols and probabilities, in careful language that refuses to chase every shadow. A skeptical author named Guy Harrison points out something that sounds reasonable. It's entirely possible that there are species we haven't discovered. The world is big. The catalog is incomplete. Discovering and describing every creature would cost a fortune. There are millions of species we may not yet know. So the idea of an unknown animal isn't silly by itself. The problem, Harrison says, is that cryptozoology tends to favor very large animals, big, charismatic, myth-heavy creatures that, if they existed, would leave evidence, bodies, bones, droppings, clear photographs, fossils, eventually. He jokes that the Patterson-Gimlin film could be a man in a cheesy ape suit, and he points out that the era was not devoid of costume work. Films like Planet of the Apes existed, so did other ambitious productions. The idea that no one could make a convincing suit in the 1960s begins to sound less like an argument and more like wishful thinking dressed up as certainty. Anthropologists add their own quiet objections. Many Bigfoot sightings happen at night, yet most higher primates are active during the day. Population biology raises another gentle problem. To sustain a breeding population, you'd need not one creature, not a pair, but hundreds, perhaps around 500 or more, to avoid extinction. How could such a population remain hidden in North America for so long without leaving undeniable traces? And there's the fossil question. We find fossils of creatures that lived hundreds of thousands, millions of years ago. We have evidence of Gigantopithecus, a massive primate that lived in Asia long ago. If giants existed then, why not now? But also, if a modern giant existed now, why is there not one clean fossil, not one unquestioned bone? This is where the idea of falsifiability enters the story like a cold, clear stream. John O'Connor discusses the difference between science and pseudoscience, using a concept often associated with philosopher Karl Popper. Real science tries to disprove itself. It proposes a null hypothesis and attempts to knock it down. If you can't disprove the null, your claim fails. Pseudoscience, by contrast, often seeks confirmation only, gathering supportive anecdotes while avoiding tests that could break the idea. Bigfoot belief, for many, rests on confirmations, footprints that might be hoaxed, films that might be staged, hairs that turn out to be deer, stories that can't be replicated under controlled conditions. And yet, the heart doesn't always care about controlled conditions. The heart wants wilderness. The heart wants the world to still contain something that refuses us. If you lie in bed and listen closely, you can sense why. Modern life is loud. It is bright. It is mapped. So the thought of a creature slipping between the trees, leaving only a print in mud, feels like a small mercy. A reminder that not everything is conquered. I've always felt that Bigfoot is less a zoological claim and more a dream we keep having together. A dream shaped like fur and shadow. A dream that lets us pretend, for a moment, that the forest still belongs to itself. So when people argue heatedly, endlessly about the film, the hairs, the tracks, they may be arguing about something deeper than a creature. They may be arguing about whether mystery is allowed to exist in a world that wants to explain everything. And as you drift now, as your breathing slows, it's okay to let the question remain unanswered. Let it be a soft shape at the edge of thought. Let the woods stay dark. Let the footprints fade in the rain. And still, let the story continue, quiet and steady, inside you. Sometimes I picture the moment the FBI letter arrives, not as a dramatic scene with trumpets, just a thin envelope landing on a desk with a soft, papery slap, the kind of mail that looks ordinary until you realize what it carries. A desk lamp makes a small circle of light. Outside that circle, the room is dim. Maybe rain is tapping a window. Not hard, just steady, like fingertips practicing patience. A coffee mug sits nearby, cold now, with a dark ring dried at the bottom. The envelope is opened with a thumb, the flap tearing in an uneven line that reveals the pale square of paper inside. And for a second, the mind runs ahead. You know that feeling, don't you? When you haven't read the answer yet, but your body already rehearses both possibilities. A little lift in the chest, a little sinking in the stomach. Hope and dread sitting side by side like tired neighbors. Dear, just that. A word that makes the room feel suddenly smaller, like the walls have stepped closer. Deer are so common they almost vanish into the background of America. They flash across roads at dusk. They stand in fields like living punctuation marks. They leave delicate tracks. And sometimes, if you've ever walked a forest path in late autumn, you've seen their droppings, scattered like dark pebbles, and you hardly even think to name it. Deer does not sell newspapers, and yet the letter itself becomes part of the lore, because the act of sending evidence to the FBI is a story. The response is a story. Even disappointment becomes an artifact that can be shown, discussed, framed. Humans are talented that way. We can turn a closed door into a room of its own, and we'll walk around inside it for years, touching the corners. Around the same time, people are gathering in small halls and motel conference rooms. They bring casts of prints wrapped in towels. They set photographs on tables as if arranging family portraits. They argue politely, then not so politely. Someone coughs. Someone laughs too loudly. Someone, late in the evening, leans in and whispers that they heard a call in the woods that didn't sound like any owl, any wolf, any man. I always find those scenes oddly tender because they are full of longing. Longing for a world that still holds a secret. Longing for proof, yes, but also longing for the feeling that proof might arrive. Imagine a person driving alone at night, leaving a town behind. The last gas station light fades in the rearview mirror. The road narrows. Trees close in. Headlights carve a tunnel through the dark. The dashboard glows a soft green, illuminating hands on the wheel, knuckles pale. The radio hisses between stations, and then a voice comes through, low, intimate, talking about tracks found near a river, talking about a creature that watches from just beyond the reach of the beam. Every so often, the driver's eyes flick to the edge of the road, because shadows can look like shoulders, and stumps can look like legs. The mind wants patterns. The mind wants a face in the dark. Bluff Creek becomes a kind of pilgrimage site. Ape Canyon becomes a name spoken with the same reverence that others reserve for battlefields. People stand where miners once claimed rocks fell from nowhere. They stare at ravines and imagine bodies tumbling into them, imagined or real. They kneel and touch the mud, as if the earth might still remember. And the earth does remember, in a way. It remembers everything that has pressed into it. Boots, hooves, the paws of bears, the delicate pads of raccoons, the feet of children who wander too far from camp. It holds all of that briefly, then lets it go when the rain arrives. That's the other truth that keeps Bigfoot alive. Nature erases. A print can be perfect at dawn, every ridge and toe clear as handwriting, and by afternoon it can be a blur, and by evening it can be nothing. A hair can cling to bark for days and then ride a gust of wind into the unknown. A sound can echo once, bounce off a cliff, and vanish forever. So the believers keep listening, and the skeptics keep asking for what cannot easily survive. When you read about cryptozoology, you'll notice how the language itself is a kind of spell. Cryptid, a word that makes the unknown feel like a category you could file. Evidence, a word that promises solidity, even when the evidence is a footprint in mud that could have been pressed by a hoaxer's wooden shoe. Still, I can't fully mock it. Honestly, I can't. Because the desire behind it is something I recognize in myself. I want there to be corners of the world that resist my understanding. I want there to be nights when the forest is not simply scenery, but a living presence with its own secrets. And if Bigfoot is not a creature, then it is certainly a mirror. It reflects our fear of the wild and our love for it. It reflects the guilt of taking land and the fantasy of being punished by something older and stronger. It reflects the childlike thrill of thinking, what if? So we arrive at a quiet paradox. The more Bigfoot becomes a pop icon, the more it risks becoming harmless. But the more it is questioned by science, the more it becomes a symbol. And symbols are difficult to kill. A deer hair can be true and still not satisfy. So, let the question rest. Let it curl up like an animal in a hollow log. Let it breathe. Let it be warm and dark and just out of reach. There is a moment in the Bigfoot story when the argument about bones and films and footprints grows tired, and you can almost feel the conversation exhale. Because for many indigenous communities, the question was never only, is it an animal? It was, what kind of presence is this? And what does it ask of us? I want you to imagine a different kind of room now. Not a motel, conference hall, not a late-night radio studio. A place where the air smells of cedar and damp earth. Where stories are not collected like trophies, but held like medicine. Where a creature in the forest is not a curiosity to be captured, but a relationship to be respected. The modern world has a way of flattening everything into one shape, either real or fake, either science or superstition. But older ways of knowing are often more patient, more layered. They allow a thing to be many things at once. In British Columbia, in the community of Harrison Hot Springs, a Sasquatch museum opened in 2017. I find that detail strangely soothing. A museum is usually a place for what has been pinned down, but here, the museum is built around something that, by its nature, refuses to be pinned. Picture the building at dusk, the sky low and gray, the kind of light that makes the world look like a photograph from another decade. A gentle rain, maybe, or fog, thick enough that the trees across the road appear and disappear like thoughts. Inside, footsteps sound soft against the floor. Visitors move slowly, almost automatically lowering their voices. Glass cases hold artifacts, photographs, carvings, interpretive displays. The air is cool, the lighting is kind. It feels less like a spectacle and more like an invitation to listen. Reports have said the museum drew around 20,000 visitors a year in the early 2020s, and that an expanded visitor center debuted in 2024. Numbers can be cold, but here they hint at something warm. People keep coming. People keep wanting to stand near a story that won't stand still. What I love, honestly, is the shift in emphasis. The museum focuses on the culture of the Stolo people, on sacred lands and healing, on pride and reverence. In that framing, Sasquatch is not merely a beast. It is tied to place. It is tied to memory. It is tied to the boundary between the physical and the spiritual. A BBC article shared a quote from a Stolo community leader, Kelsey Charlie, describing a tradition in which these beings can change from their physical form into a rock, a tree, even another animal. You can feel the power of that idea without trying to prove it. The world, after all, does change shape in the dark. Shadows turn branches into hands. Fog turns hills into islands. A person in grief can become quiet as stone. Charlie also recalled something his grandfather used to say, that the Sasquatch is a shapeshifter who can walk in two realms, the spiritual and the physical, and that this is why you'll never catch him. There is something almost gentle in that refusal, like a boundary drawn in soft charcoal. You may look, you may wonder, you may tell stories, but you may not own. When I think about that, I feel the whole Bigfoot history rearrange itself. The miners in 1850 who thought hairy giants were attacking their cabins. The men in Ape Canyon firing rifles into the night. The hoaxed wooden footprints that became headlines. The shaky film by Bluff Creek. The hares mailed to the FBI and pronounced deer. The skeptics asking for fossils. The believers driving roads at midnight, hoping for a silhouette. All of it becomes a long, restless conversation between humans and wilderness. And maybe the wilderness does not speak in words. Maybe it speaks in absence. Think of a forest at night, far from towns. No engines, no neon. The air is cold enough that it feels clean. A creek threads through the dark, making a sound like slow breathing. An owl calls once, then stops, as if listening. The wind moves through branches with a hush that can sound like footsteps if you're already expecting them. You know that feeling, don't you? When you stand in such a place and realize you are not the center. Your thoughts, your worries, your plans, they shrink. The world is older. The trees are indifferent. The night is wide. In that space, the idea of Sasquatch, whether flesh and blood or spirit or symbol, becomes less about proof and more about humility. It becomes a reminder that there are rules you did not write. A researcher named Thomas Steenberg offered a closing thought that feels, to me, like a lullaby disguised as an argument. He suggested that Sasquatch, if it exists, is a symbol that there is still wilderness out there. We haven't tamed everything. Listen to that for a moment. Let the sentence settle. We haven't tamed everything. The words are simple, but they open a door. They point back through history, to the wild man stories of Europe, to Enkidu in the ancient epic, to the Yeti in the Himalayas, to the Yowie in Australia, to every culture that has imagined a hairy figure at the edge of the known. People who never met, separated by oceans and centuries, all leaving a small space in their stories for something that lives beyond the fence. Maybe that space is where we put our fear. Maybe it's where we put our hope. I like to think it's where we put our respect. Because if the world is fully mapped and fully cataloged and fully domesticated, something in the human soul goes quiet in the wrong way. A kind of hunger appears. We start to crave mystery, like we crave sleep. So Bigfoot persists, not because the evidence is perfect, but because the need is old. And even if, one day, every footprint is explained, every film is debunked, every hair is traced to deer or bear or human prank, the symbol will remain, a tall shape in the trees, a reminder that the wild has not been entirely replaced by parking lots. Now, as you lie there, I want you to let the argument drift away. Let the numbers and names dissolve like fog. Keep only the feeling. A dark forest, a cold creek, a distant ridge under moonlight, the sense that something watches, not with malice, but with the calm attention of an animal that does not need you. Your breathing can slow, your shoulders can soften. The room you are in can become part of that larger quiet. The walls fall away in imagination, and you are left with the sound of wind through branches, and the steady rhythm of your own heart, and the gentle idea that the world is still wide. If a shadow moves at the edge of thought, let it move. Don't chase it. Don't name it. Just let it pass, like a cloud. And if you ever wake in the night, and you think you hear a distant knock, a branch tapping another branch, remember this. Forests are full of small noises, and most of them mean nothing at all. They are just the world shifting in its sleep. Let me linger with you in that museum for a while, as if we have all the time in the world, as if clocks have politely stepped outside. There is a corner where carved faces look out from wood, their expressions calm and serious. The grain of the timber runs like slow water. If you lean close, you might smell varnish, faint and sweet, mixed with the older scent of cedar that clings to everything in this region. Somewhere, a heater clicks softly. A child whispers, then remembers where they are and whispers even more quietly, as if the building itself deserves courtesy. I always feel a strange tenderness toward museums because they are built from a human fear, the fear that memory will vanish. We put things behind glass the way we tuck letters into drawers. We label them. We date them. We pretend that naming something is the same as keeping it. But here, the object behind the glass is not the main point. The main point is what cannot be placed behind glass. A map on a wall shows rivers and valleys. The Harrison River Valley, a place that has held people for thousands of years. You can trace the blue lines with your eyes, the way you might trace a vein under skin. Water is always moving, always going somewhere else, and yet it also returns, in rain, in snow, in mist. It's a good teacher, water. It reminds you that even when a thing leaves, it is still part of the cycle. I picture stepping outside after the museum, the door closing with a gentle thump, and the air meeting your face like a cool cloth. The ground is damp. Gravel shifts underfoot with a soft crunch. Far off, the hot springs release a faint mineral smell, like stones warmed by the earth's own slow breath. Lights from buildings glow through fog, blurred and gentle, as if someone has smeared the edges of the world with a thumb. You walk toward the trees, not deep into them, just close enough to feel the change. The forest edge is different from open space. Sound behaves differently there. Your footsteps seem to get swallowed. The wind quiets. Even the temperature can drop a little, the shade holding on to cold. And I always notice how the mind changes at the tree line. It becomes older, it becomes cautious. It begins to imagine eyes between trunks, not because you are foolish, but because you are human, and humans evolved by paying attention. A raven calls. The sound is harsh, then gone. In the pause that follows, you can hear your own breathing. In, out, in, out. Slow, reliable. The most ancient rhythm you have. If someone were to tell you, right then, that a shapeshifter walks nearby, sometimes fir, sometimes rock, sometimes tree, you might not argue. Not in that moment, because the forest already feels like it's shifting. Leaves tremble, shadows drift. A cloud passes over the moon, and the whole landscape changes tone, as if someone turned a dial. I've always felt that the best stories are the ones that make you behave differently. They make you lower your voice. They make you look at the ground before you step. They make you consider what might be watching, not to frighten you, but to remind you that you are not alone in the world. That, to me, is the deepest difference between monster stories and spirit stories. A monster story invites you to conquer or escape. A spirit story invites you to respect, and respect has a weight to it. It slows you down. It makes you careful. In older accounts, the Sasquatch-like beings are sometimes protectors of nature, sometimes punishers of those who take too much, sometimes tricksters, sometimes warnings. Even the way the stories are told carries instruction. Don't wander alone. Don't mock what you don't understand. Don't treat the wilderness like it is yours. You can see how those lessons collided with colonizers' hunger. Miners came with axes and rifles and impatience. Loggers came with saws that screamed through the day. Roads arrived. Towns spread. The forest, in many places, shrank into islands. And into that shrinking world, Bigfoot entered as a rumor that refused to shrink. And in that hush, the night feels larger, and you relax into being small again. That is how myths survive. They attach to routine. They ride in pockets. They sit in the back of the mind, while you do ordinary things. And when pop culture turns Bigfoot into a friendly character, it is almost like a compromise, a way of letting the myth stay, but making it less sharp, less accusatory, less wild. A big hairy neighbor who means no harm. Still, there is always that older note underneath, the note that says the wild is not yours. If you let your thoughts drift back through everything we've traced, Yeti, wild man, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, there's a single thread you can hold without tightening your fist around it. The thread is wonder. The thread is the human tendency to stand at the edge of the unknown and feel both fear and delight, like standing near deep water and hearing it move. Now bring that feeling back to your room. Feel the weight of your blanket. Feel the softness of your pillow. Notice the tiny sounds that happen in any building at night. A pipe cooling, a faint creak, the whisper of fabric when you breathe. Your body is allowed to be heavy. Your thoughts are allowed to be slow. You don't have to solve anything tonight. Let the forest do what forests do. Let the creek keep flowing in the dark. Let the shapeshifter, if you want to believe, if only for the comfort of it, walk between realms where your questions cannot follow. There is peace in not catching everything. There is peace in leaving some doors closed. And the next time you hear a story that feels too strange, too wild, You can just let it sit beside you for a moment, like a quiet companion. No need to argue, no need to prove. Just listen, and then let it drift away, the way mist drifts away when morning comes. So rest now. Let the wilderness keep its secrets. Let the creature real, imagined, spiritual, symbolic, continue to walk where it has always walked, beyond the reach of your lamp, beyond the reach of your proof, in the soft and endless dark. Good night.